presenter is Chris Janzer. He's a familiar face here at Mira. We always appreciate him spending the time and coming to give us these updates. He oversees the Michigan's K-12 accountability systems. He also has done development and design as well as implementation of a number of Michigan accountability systems, because if you've been in Michigan long enough, you know that we've had quite a few. He has also worked on the A to F letter grading, and he helped design and implement the parent-friendly school dashboard. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Kathy. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here again. As Kathy said, this is just going to be a basic update presentation. I'm going to share my screen. I will kind of launch right into it. If you've been paying attention over the last month or so, not a lot of this will be new, but I'm hoping some details I share today will potentially be new stuff that you can take back to your districts. So I'm going to cover the waivers, I'll do a little bit on the assessment side, but I know Andy will be here later this afternoon and he'll cover the assessments in greater detail. So I'll just hit on that very, very briefly. I'll cover the accountability waiver and go through the impact that has both at our federal level as well as what we're still potentially doing at the state level. And then I'll wrap up with some state assessment stuff that is very related to accountability. Again, I don't want to ruin or step on Andy's presentation later today. So I'll, if you do have assessment questions, I may be able to answer some, but Andy will be able to hopefully answer more detailed ones that you have. And then I'll just round it out with some resources that we've recently posted on the accountability page. So getting right into the waivers, I think everyone is probably pretty familiar with the assessment and accountability waiver statuses that we've had now for the last month. Accountability at the federal level has been waived again. The feds put out a pretty simple, basic template for all states to use to request accountability waivers for the 2021 school year. I think like most states, if not all, Michigan applied and was accepted. There wasn't really any room for customization with it. It was really checking boxes off, much like the one that we had last year. So we applied for, and that was waived a few weeks ago, or approved a few weeks ago. A little bit different than compared to the one that we had last year is there are still some public reporting requirements, and I'll get into those details here in a few minutes. On the assessment side, this was probably bigger news for a longer time, but MDE had been working on a blanket assessment waiver, which also covered accountability. And that was submitted to the US Department of Education back in late January. And there was a little bit of back and forth, but they ultimately ended up not approving that waiver. And I think, as everyone knows, the schools and districts have been testing or doing their best to assess students the last couple of weeks. On the state side, there hasn't been any waivers for 2021 yet. Last year, the governor had the executive order that suspended testing. For those of you that pay more attention to the accountability side of things, you may remember that we didn't have the A to F system waived or suspended for the 1920 school year. So we did end up running a partial system of that last fall. So far, as of today, there has not been any waivers on the accountability side for the state level accountability requirements. The department is working on that. I know there's been pressure not only for the A to F system, but the third grade reading law. And I know that is something that we're really running out of time on that one. Andy might cover that one later, as well as educator evaluations, which is a different sort of accountability, but that has not yet been waived either. You'll see the 2021 waiver status column for the state level assessment. We have not waived here. That's really, even if the state legislature went and suspended them at this point, when we're kind of in the middle of the assessment window, it really would have no effect. The federal requirements would still stand. All right. So let me talk a bit about federal accountability, specifically the school index. So pretty much just like last year, we won't be running the school index system. The feds waived the requirement to do that. That includes all components of it, not just the assessment related ones. So things like, even though we'll have graduation rates, actually from the 1920 school year, which we would have used in the 2021 index, we won't be doing any sort of accountability stuff with graduation rate or any of the school quality student success metrics. The feds have also continued, they call it a pause in the identification of CSI, TSI, and ATS schools. So the pause is both in the identification as well as the exiting of these schools if they have an existing identification status. However, states are allowed to exit comprehensive support and improvement schools if they were identified before solely for having a low graduation rate. So that's that 67% four-year rate. The department, Michigan Department of Education is looking into what we're going to do with that. I don't have sort of final decision in that. The accountability unit kind of runs things and then hands things off to other offices. But there are conversations going on potentially releasing CSI schools that were identified originally with a low graduation rate, but and now have graduation rates that are above that 67%. So more to come on that. Targeted support and improvement schools, we won't be identifying them or the additional targeted support schools. There is no mechanism to exit additional targeted support schools this year or this cycle. For your targeted support and improvement schools, for those of you that have those in your districts, that had always been a local decision on when and what criteria to use to exit those schools. So if you have those schools, that there wouldn't really be anything coming from MDE at this point for them anyway. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's see here. So I covered that. And then the reporting of results has been waived as well. So obviously we're not calculating anything. We won't have school index results to report out, including those non-assessment related components, even though we do have data for those. Let me move into the reporting piece here. So the federal reporting requirements are largely going to be through the annual education report that we all know and love. It's required for 2021. The big difference with this upcoming AER cycle is that the feds are expecting states to include assessment results, including participation rates in these AER reports for 2021. The 1920 reports, because we didn't have test results, we didn't include those, they weren't required. But this was essentially part of the accountability waiver. One of the assurances was that Michigan, and of course any other state that applied, would report out assessment results, including participation rates. The rest of this here, you can see is your kind of your typical normal AER report. You'll notice chronic absenteeism rates I have called out specifically. That was called out specifically in the federal accountability waiver as well. We had to assure that we would report those. That is normally part of the accountability, the index system. And so we'll be reporting it out on the AER. I don't know exactly where. Typically, well, what we did last year was hide the assessment and accountability tabs, or most of the information on there. So it'll be there. It might just look a little bit different. And that's something that we'll be fleshing out in the coming months. Let's see here, educator information, that's not new from last year. Per pupil expenditures, this will be the second year that we report these out. They made an appearance last year for the first time. And then my and more excited sort of last bullet point there. The expectation is that states still report NAEP data, even though it won't be fresh. Obviously, the feds aren't assessing students on NAEP this year. So this will be fairly stale NAEP data. And then we'll have the civil rights data collection and the school improvement grant funding, which is part of the AER for the last couple of years as well. So all that stuff will be reported publicly. I'm anticipating this will be, because we'll have assessment results, it'll be sometime this coming fall. Might be a little bit earlier than what we normally do. We kind of got to see what the data looks like and if we're going to do anything special as far as calling out how this is a very unique year for reporting these things out. All right, so let me move on here.
Chris, there was a question about when will school level expenditures be available for the.
I believe CEPI just did a refresh of last year. I'm not sure when we'll have the most recent data. Let me take that one back and I will follow up with an answer on that one.
Thank you.
Sure. So moving on to the state accountability level. This is the A to F system school grades. I mentioned there is no waiver for it yet. We still have our fingers crossed that it does get suspended because unlike last year, we would be able to run the full system with assessment data. Again, depending on what that looks like. Although the law doesn't really have much in the way of taking into account low participation rates and that sort of a thing. So more to come on whether or not we're doing it. If we were made to do it, be aware that it's potentially going to be a full run of it. Again, we'll kind of see. I know the legislature right now is starting to really get into the thick of budgeting talks for the next fiscal year. So I'm hoping that that goes fairly smoothly and that they can address some of these lingering accountability pieces that are still sitting out there before fall. I mentioned we ran the school grade system last year to comply with the state law when it wasn't waived or EO'd out, and it was a partial run. We did have WIDA data from 1920 that we were able to use. We had, it was about 90–95% participation in WIDA, so we had a good data set and we were comfortable running that. And we released it without really any fanfare back in early November. I didn't really, or the team didn't really get many questions on it from schools or districts. We did note that there were a few newspaper articles, but it wasn't like a normal kind of media frenzy that sometimes accompanies accountability releases. It'll be interesting if we do have to run this this fall, if there will be more attention, because we would potentially have test scores included in it. But again, we're still months away from having to run it, and hopefully we'll be able to know sooner than that whether we'll actually have to run it or not. Moving on to state reporting. So we've been updating the parent dashboard continuously with non-assessment data. So things like graduation rate, we've updated as we've gotten them. And just note that as data comes in, we will continue to update it. So schools have been doing a really good job with submitting good data to CEPI. And continue that. Just know that that will be out there publicly. We haven't made a decision yet on whether assessment results will be reported out on the parent dashboard for 2021. It really depends on what the data look like as far as reliability and validity go. Hopefully by midsummer we'll have a better idea. And this is something that OEAA will have quite a bit of discussion on. We've started talking about where and when we report out assessment results in a normal year. So sort of taking inventory of all of the different pieces that get out into the different areas publicly. So we're taking stock of that just so that we're kind of ready to deal with that as we know how the assessment results look as far as reliability and validity go. Talk a little bit further about the parent dashboard. Over the coming months, you should see several enhancements to it. We're going to be including more detailed student demographics on the overview page. So you'll see like gender breakdown and subgroup breakdowns. We're also including a little bit more school information on the search map. If you've used that in the past and you drill down to the level where you can click on a school building, you just get the school's name, address, and then you click further to go into the overview. We're going to be providing just 2 simple bar graphs showing the school's proficiency compared to the state proficiency. We'll be using, I believe, to begin with, data from 1819 for that. So again, this kind of builds back into that. What is 2021 going to look like as far as assessment results go? We're also going to be including a simpler version of the per pupil expenditures at the school level in the parent dashboard. The federal requirements are very detailed, and so we felt that wasn't as appropriate to include in the parent dashboard using the full requirements. So we're taking a slice of what we're currently reporting. It's not a new calculation or anything like that. It comes from the same data set. I believe we're just going to be looking at like total per pupil expenditures instead of breaking it out by the different funding types. And we are working with CEPI to create appropriate messaging around data that continue to be reported. We're also going to be thinking about ways to differentiate the way that we report data out visually for 2021, just to make sure people are aware that this is, again, a very, very unique year when it comes to assessment results. I'm going to mention one more thing that I don't have on the slide here. This also kind of gets to things that we're thinking about. We are planning on calculating our SGP and AGP growth values for students. We again, don't know what they're going to look like. Right now, you can assume that we won't have values for fourth graders since they didn't test as third graders. So we would have growth scores for 5th through 8th grade as well as high school. And one of the other things that we're exploring with our vendor is I'll call it a reference growth score, looking at older data and trying to extrapolate from that as if there wasn't a pandemic year or an interrupted year of school happening. So more to come on that. A lot of what we're thinking about doing, we won't know for sure until we really know what that assessment data looks like. I'm going to pop open the chat here real quick. No, I don't know if I can do that. Were there questions? I can't bring up my chat while I'm sharing, unfortunately.
Yeah, Chris, there was one. It says if you do have to run the state accountability, do you have any additional information in regards to the state CSI and TSI identification? I guess there was an office hour webinar last week, and I guess where are we at with that?
Yep, so no new information on that. So state law requires that there is a identification made for the law references lowest performing schools, although it uses a very different way of calculating that than the index. So we could potentially identify CSI schools using A to F, we'll call it a state CSI identification. That is a requirement of the law, and at some point we are going to have to do that. The intent was to always identify the same time that we identify CSI schools in the index, so that we're not having staggered identifications of sort of the same concept going on. I believe the law required us to identify state CSI schools in 1920. We got out of that because we didn't have test data. Our hope is that we don't identify this year, even if we have to run, and defend that by saying we'll identify in fall of 22 when we're next supposed to identify on the federal side. However, that's really dependent on how flexible the state legislature is with all of that. So I'll leave it with, there is a requirement in the state legislation. However, our intent is to hold off on that for another year so that we can align the federal and state identification cycles. As far as TSI and ATS go, the way that we interpreted the state legislation was because it referred to ESSA, we built the A to F system to rely on the index system for the TSI and ATS identification. So there will not be TSI and ATS identifications in the A to F system this year or any year. TSI and ATS are only going to be identified using the school index. I'm hoping that addresses that. So bottom line is my feeling is a very, very small chance that we identify state CSI schools in 21-22. I mean, my gut says that we won't, just because of the sensitivity of this year and the data that is going to be coming out of it. But the legislature sometimes does surprise us. Was there another question too? Or
Yeah, another one popped up, and it's kind of a follow-up. It says there are a lot of schools who are saying there will not be any penalty or consequence for students, school, or district if a virtual academy student does not take the state assessment this year due to the message MDE has provided. Is this basically, is there going to be a consequence if they don't test? Where is this going to play out in the participation and the identification of schools under the state law in school grades?
It's a great question too. So as far as accountability consequences go, high stakes, the A to F system does not use participation as part of the CSI criteria. That's unlike the school index where that does play a factor. So even if we were to run A to F and then identify state CSI schools, a low participation rate wouldn't technically factor into that identification. However, you can kind of logically follow if a school had a low participation rate and for whatever reason, the students that did test had lower scores than if the school tested all of its students, that could factor into that could lower your proficiency and or growth, which would factor into that identification. As far as just having a participation rate below 95%, there is no consequence for that this year. The federal waivers specifically address that. So other than that very minute chance of us identifying state CSI schools, there is no other high stakes attached to participation. However, I know some schools and districts look at public reporting as high stakes. So they do know that we will be reporting participation rates. So some folks might not like seeing a 50% participation rate out there. They would call that high stakes accountability, maybe. So that's really about it as far as consequences go.
Thank you. I know your next slide is talking about the attendance piece, which I don't know if COVID then counts against the participation rate. It's not considered excused, or maybe you're going to get to that in a minute.
Yeah, I'll talk about that. And looks like I have a few minutes left. So, and I'm actually going to wrap up. This is my last slide with any substance on it. So let's talk again real briefly about the assessment side and participation and all that. So who must test? And it sounds like people are familiar with sort of the language that the department has put out there. Hopefully it's gotten a little bit more clear. I know initially it wasn't the most clear, and I know there were a lot of questions off the bat. But you can, that first bullet takes the wording pretty much directly from what was communicated. The expectation is that students test. Students that are 100% remote or 100% virtual, they're not required to come into school solely for the purpose of taking the tests. Certainly we've heard some districts are doing that. Again, that's not, like, no one's going to come in and tell them not to do that, but that is happening. As far as I'm concerned with student participation, we have created an umbrella reason for COVID that we'll use for the students not tested window later this spring, early summer. It's not a detailed one. It's basically COVID related, and it's meant to cover basically anything, anything down to things like parent refuses to let student come into test for COVID reasons. If the student has COVID, that kind of stuff. So any sort of COVID related thing should be covered by this one reason. And our intent was to make this as easy as possible on people that are having to look at this sort of thing. We believe we've made it easy enough where you don't even need to log into the secure site to look at this. And my reasoning for that is that most students will have the COVID related reason preloaded for them if they haven't taken the assessment. So normally in a normal year, when you log into the secure site and go to students not tested, you would see students show up on your roster with open records if we didn't have an answer document associated with them. This year, any student that doesn't have an answer document associated with them, once they get into the students not tested part of the secure site, you'll see the COVID related reason for them. The issue for each individual student, we're going to leave open. And that's in case districts or buildings want to change reasons for whatever reasons that they may have locally, if they do some sort of reporting out of why students aren't testing at a local level, that will still be doable. So that said, though, if you don't want to even log in, just know that that anyone will have the COVID-related reason loaded for them, and then any open issue at the end of the students not tested window will be populated with the COVID reason if there isn't a reason already populated, and we'll close them out. And then the same goes for any open issue with the COVID reason. We'll keep the COVID reason and close it out. So we're hoping that that minimizes the need for people to go in at the very end of the school year and worry about having to upload stuff and check on things in their buildings and all that sort of thing. And we will still have, or you will still have the ability to upload documentation. Chances are we won't be looking at it, and it's not necessary for this year. So that said, because we're not really calculating participation rates for accountability, we're not taking deductions or additions or anything like that. So the participation rate coming out of this testing season is just going to be the raw participation rate. I hope. Are there any other questions before I move on to my last slide? I hope that helps clear things up. I will mention we should have a short resource available, I'm hoping next week, that covers some of the detail that I just talked about with students not tested.
Chris, can I just ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
So when you're talking about calculating the students, participation rate, those students that are flagged for COVID reasons, they're going to be included in the N size, correct? So, I mean, that percentage is just going to be lower, right? You're not exempting them just because it's a COVID related.
Correct.
Reason.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yep. Because there is no 95% requirement, we got rid of that's why we did the exemption kind of stuff. We would remove students from the denominator depending on the reason, that kind of thing. Yeah. So yeah, when I say raw rate, we won't be manipulating the denominator or numerator for anything this year. It's just going to be a straight up participation rate for public reporting.
So coding the COVID doesn't really excuse or exempt them. So a school, technically from a participation rate, even though we don't have accountability, they're going to be accountable for participation from the public reporting.
Right. Yes, and I know some districts do view that as like an accountability thing versus it just being a public reporting. But there are no, as I talked about earlier, other than that, hopefully very, very tiny chance of us identifying state CSI schools, there really is no accountability consequences for a low participation rate.
But it would impact the CSI schools then?
If we were to identify state CSI, my thinking here is you could have a situation where a school did the best that they could and tested as many students as possible, and for whatever reason, most of their higher performing students didn't test. That would potentially then lower their proficiency and growth scores, which are used in the A to F system to calculate CSI.
Okay,
So,
okay, well, thank you.
yep. All right, so let me quickly just get through the rest of this. This is my last slide, actually. We did have an office hours a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned, and that was when we had released our updated FAQ document covering COVID-19 related questions, specifically for accountability. The assessment side of OEAA also has a FAQ out there. My group put together a waiver brief for the federal accountability waiver. And as always, I know everyone knows about the Spotlight newsletters. Those are out there as well. So those are all clickable. If you happen to grab a copy of this presentation, they should take you right to those resources. You guys know how to get a hold of me and the team. And I'll just mention again, keep your eyes out for our Students Not Tested resource soon. If not next week, it'll be the week after, but we're putting the finishing touches on it. So that is all I had, unless there are other questions.